Everything started in a suburb in Chicago in 1993. I had just turned 18 that day. I lived in a neighborhood where everyone was poor, and it was controlled by the Italian Mafia. Many kids in my neighborhood worked with them, helping them to unload trucks and serving as lookouts if the cops are around. They also stole from newly opened shops that weren't protected by the organization. We, on the other side, the people who were not Italian, could only watch and not take our share of the profits. The day I turned 18, I went to a bar for the first time. I sat down and asked the bartender to give me a drink, some whiskey. The bartender looked at me, then at some people who were sitting next to me, and started laughing very loudly. I still remember that laugh. It really hurt my feelings. I waited for my drink, but it seemed like the bartender had no intention of bringing me anything. So after 30 minutes of waiting, I stood up and went out to the parking lot, near the back door of the bar. The bartender's car was there, so I could have broken the windshield or set it on fire. Those actions might have been reasonable if he made a bad joke or mispronounced my name. Something minor. But this disrespect was far more serious. The bartender should pay the price himself, so it was around 9 p.m. I walked to a nearby gas station, and along the way I found an empty 1-gallon jug. I think it was for milk. I filled the jug with gasoline and returned to the parking lot. I stood there in the shadows, smoking my cigarette and staring at the car. It was a very cold night. I waited for around 5 hours until I could no longer feel my hands or feet because of the cold. Finally, the bar's back door opened and a man walked out. It was the bartender. He walked to his car and I started approaching, the gallon of gasoline in my hand, heading towards the car. He didn't notice me, so he was focused on opening his car and getting in. I opened the jug of gasoline, walked to his side of the car, opened his door, and poured the gasoline on him, then quickly shut the door. Gasoline spilled all over him and inside the car, and I stepped back, and then he opened the door, and it took him a few seconds to realize it was actually gasoline. As soon as he opened the door, I threw my lit cigarette towards him. Instantly, everything was in flames. I turned away and walked home. Back then, there were no security cameras. On the way home, surprisingly, I caught myself thinking about what I would have for dinner. I felt no remorse for the act of killing, nor for the person who was probably still burning in that car. This felt a bit odd. I had expected that taking a life, especially for the first time, would be more terrifying. It took me less than 5 minutes to reach my apartment. I entered to find the TV still on, showing some wildlife documentary. I've always enjoyed watching wildlife documentaries. They filled most of my days. I lived alone, a story for another time on how that came to be. My days were mostly spent watching TV, eating too little, and smoking too much. The next morning, when I went outside, I noticed a small truck parked nearby, of course belonging to the Mafia. Who else would dare do business on our street? A group of young kids, about 14 years old, were unloading cigarettes under the supervision of someone who seemed about my age, clearly the one in charge. I walked up to him and said, "I want to work with you." So he gave me a smile and said, "But you're not Italian, are you?" It's a well-known fact that traditionally, non-Italians can't be made members of the Mafia. However, they often hire outsiders for specific tasks, paying them per job, especially for hitman jobs. I told him, "I want to be a hitman. I'm ready to handle the dirty work. Maybe your boss might be interested." A couple of weeks went by. One of the Italian kids from the cigarette truck knocked on my apartment door. I opened the door and he told me that their boss wanted to see me. He gave me an address and told me to go later that day after 4 p.m. I put on some of my best clothes, thinking to myself, life is about to begin. And on my way to the address, I began to wonder if I was going the right way. I had envisioned a farm or a grand mansion, perhaps surrounded by Ferraris and Porsches, guarded by men with dogs and heavy weaponry. However, the actual location was nothing like that. It was a business district, filled with company offices and tall buildings. When I finally arrived at the correct address, I realized I had no idea what I was getting myself into. But I was very curious. The piece of paper from the young boy directed me to go to the 10th floor. I took the elevator and took a little while before I reached my destination. My heart was pounding and I felt really stressed. When arriving, it appeared as though I had entered an office belonging to a hedge fund. Before me was a very big office space, and at the reception desk sat a young woman. Beside her was an equally beautiful young girl, probably around 21 years old, dressed even more elegantly than the receptionist. They were engaged in some conversation, but upon noticing me, the older woman looked at the clock on the wall and then made a sign with her head to the young girl to guide me. The young girl approached me, asking if I had an appointment with Mr. Francesco. After I confirmed, she told me to take a seat and wait, and proceeded to open a large door and enter the room. She remained inside for about 3 minutes. Then she went out and informed me that I could now meet Mr. Francesco. As I approached the big door, I was nervous, yet managed to hide it. This was my moment. I was about to meet a mafia boss. Once inside the office, I was greeted by the sound of piano music, a classical piece unfamiliar to me at the time, but one I promised myself to learn more about later. The room was very big, much bigger than my entire apartment, and extremely clean. A bookshelf on one side, right next to a large window, and in the center, a massive desk, giving the room the air of a successful finance executive office. A hat and a coat were neatly hung on a coat rack, positioned so perfectly was as if an artist had arranged them. The meticulous organization of the room contrasted sharply with the chaotic image one might associate with the mafia. Classical music continued to play softly, and I had been in the room for about a minute, not too far from the door. Then I tried to clear my throat to ask if anyone was present when I heard, "Shh." The sound came from the other side of the room, a section that I could not see from where I was standing. I took a couple of steps forward, and there he was, Mr. Francesco. He was dressed in a suit, and over it he wore a white lab coat. He was painting on a canvas. Advancing another 2 steps to get a better look, I saw what he was painting, a big pear. He was meticulously painting a solitary, oversized pear on a large canvas, dedicating his full attention to this simple yet striking piece. He had signaled for silence earlier, as the piano track he was deeply immersed in was nearing its beautiful finale, and he wished to enjoy it without interruption. Shortly after the music ceased, Mr. Francesco then carefully placed his paintbrush in a glass beside the canvas, removed his lab coat, and meticulously folded it before setting it on a chair. Remarkably, both his attire and the coat remained pristine, untouched by any paint. So he was working on a very large canvas, yet impressively, not a single drop of paint touched the floor, his hands, or his coat. He turned to me and said, "Take a seat," pointing at the chair by his desk. Then he sat down himself. Opening a drawer, he asked me without looking up, "Did you like that assistant?" I replied, "Yes, she seemed nice." Then he said, "It's her first day with us." Then I said, Then he put a rope and a large suitcase on the desk. Standing up, he put on his jacket and hat and walked towards the door. My eyes were fixed on the rope. He then said, "You see that rope and that suitcase? I need you to use them to take care of the assistant. Put her in the suitcase and leave it in the garage within 10 minutes. Make sure no one sees you." And just as he was about to leave, he turned back to me and added, "Oh, and keep my office clean." Then he left.
I hope to share the grace you